I imagine much of the world, especially the West, has been fought over and in many ways covered by two basic different types of law, at least in the West, right? Statute law on the one hand and common law on the other. You might call it Justinian law, this sort of legislature made law on the one hand, and common law, which is, you know, more about, aggregations of judges and peers making law through precedent. And if I got that in any way wrong, let me know. But the way I see those two different types of law is sort of battling it out throughout history and through time. So help us understand these two types and why you prefer one of them over the other.
Okay, that's an interesting way of putting it. And you're right. To get started, I probably should describe what I'm talking about when I'm talking about common law and what the
Okay.
difference is between common law and statutory law. And if I do that well, then I can comment on whether they're actually battling each other or whether it's been a completely one-sided war. At any rate, common law is where law starts. Nobody comes into the world with a government already existing. People have to learn to live together peacefully in order for there to be society, in order for people to progress. And law originates in the kind of practices that allow people to cooperate. So there'll be some kind of conflict, many ways of settling it. Some are tried and don't work, so they're not repeated. Some are tried and work. People understand that's a good way of resolving conflicts. They repeat it, and over time, a practice develops. As you get from primitive societies into more advanced societies, the kind of what's ordinarily called customary law, customary practices that allow people to peacefully interact and cooperate, get repeated, and they become rules. And at some point, you may get to the point at which the rules become enforced by certain agencies. So in English history, what happened was after the Norman conquest, when kings became the enforcers, the customary law of England started to be enforced in royal courts, and those courts are what are called the common law courts. So the law of England and of the United States that governs most of our interaction, which is contract law, tort law, which is personal injury law, property law, all of those rules evolved over time because they help people cooperate and settle disputes. And they became enforced in the royal courts. And that meant that they were spread throughout the entire realm. And they were the common law, the law that's common to the realm. As you get closer and closer and closer to the present, the legislatures make more rules. So Parliament could make law. That's statutory law. In the United States, the state legislatures make law. The federal government makes law. That's politicians consciously making law by passing statutes, and that's statutory law. So that's sort of the groundwork. You said there's been a battle between them. That may be a correct way of expressing it, but it's been a very one-sided battle. And the reason is that statutory law can always replace common law. So whenever a political entity, whether it's parliament or state legislatures or federal legislature, decides to pass a statute, that statute replaces whatever the underlying rules of common law are. So statutes always win. Now, whether or not that's a good thing is something that I write about. But at least between the two of them, the politicians always have the upper hand, and common law will fall to any new statutory measure.
So if you have so we can imagine a world where really statute law predominates. It's sort of
That's the
covering
world we
more.
live in. That's the world we actually live in.
That's the world we live in, right? I mean, there are vestiges of the common law or this customary law, but what would the world look like if we were to revive it or it achieved something of a renaissance? What would that look like?
That's a great question, and my answer is going to seem counterintuitive. But it would look like the world we currently live in with a lot less strife. So why? Contract law evolved over many years. Contract law allows people to cooperate, businesses to succeed, prosperity to be achieved, and that's still the way it is. Contract law came from common law. It works well. Tort law, which is the law governing personal injuries. Over a long period of time, we learned how to provide compensation when people behave wrongfully that produces a certain level of peace. That works. Like the underlying common law is what allows us to cooperate. Statutory law has increased from the 19th century to the 20th to the 21st century so that we live in a world that's rife with statutory law. But statutory law often doesn't help cooperation, but creates strife. In other words, a statute can be something that in a divided government, one side passes that the other side doesn't agree with. So should the abortion be against the law? There's a division on that, but if you pass a statute on it, then half of the people who disagree think that there's something wrong. The present is a pretty good illustration of the kinds of divisions that come out of the political process where one side's passing laws that other people disagree with. And political strife is a result of a battle for control of the political mechanisms that create the law. So we live in a world in which the underlying law that allows us to cooperate was common law, came out of the common law, that still exists. That's what provides a peaceful, productive society. The other part of our law, which is statutory law, sometimes it's perfectly fine. Sometimes it helps people cooperate. Sometimes it's not objectionable. But in most of the controversial cases, whether it's abortion or political or freedom of speech, these kind of issues, it doesn't provide cooperation. It's one side trying to suppress the other, and that's where the political strife comes from. So that's a long answer. The answer is, if we didn't have statutory law and we could revert to a common law system, what would the world look like? And it would look like it looks now without the political strife that overlays the way we act.
So, in a manner of speaking, or even quite literally, it's almost as if you're focusing on the means of making, or the means of cooperation, as you said, but also frictions. So if we have a disagreement about the use of my property versus yours, or over a contract and how to interpret that contract, and so on, those frictions are to be decided in some sense by third parties rather than some sort of distant legislator with the notion of the one true way. Is that more how things, and can there be some variability with the outcomes that creates a patchwork of legal frameworks?
Yeah, I agree with everything you're saying.
Okay.
It's just that we're speaking at too abstract a level now, which is a danger for people like me with a PhD in philosophy.
Okay.
But what would probably be more useful would be to bring it down to a more practical level and provide illustrations. So let me
Great.
illustrate the points I'm trying to make with discussion of tort law. Tort law is what I teach at Georgetown. It's a personal injury law. How do we know what rules we need in order to interact peacefully? And maybe I'll use this as an illustration. I teach from a traditional casebook. It's been used for years. It's a great casebook. It has cases from the 19th century, the 20th century. It's wonderful. But a lot of the cases in the torts casebook are about railroads. Students are asking, how come there's so many cases about railroads? And the explanation is because at one point in time, railroads were new technology. They were making the country more connected. They were creating prosperity, but it was new technology and we didn't actually know how to use it safely. And so conflicts developed. A spark would cause a fire. Somebody would suffer damage. What should we do about this? Well, lawsuits developed and the lawsuits resolved the case. The lawsuits that are in the casebook are the ones that resolve things successfully. And over time, they became the rules governing railroads. And now, in the casebook, there's almost no more cases governing railroads. But in the 1990s, there was a new technology, new reproductive technologies. Now, it's things like AI is going on. We have new technology. We don't know how to use it safely. The typical approach to issues like that is to go to politicians and say, make some rules. But they don't know any better than we do. In fact, they're probably influenced by considerations other than what would be the best rules. But if you allow lawsuits to evolve, that's how we learn what rules work best and are stable. We're not smart enough to make rules that will allow people to cooperate in advance. We're just not smart enough. There's too many possibilities. We don't have the intellectual capacity. This is sort of a Hayekian point. But the way we learn about what law should be is through a trial and error process. Here's something that causes conflicts. One state tries to resolve it, bad resolution. Another state tries to resolve it, there's a lot of cases, a state comes up with a resolution that's stable. Everybody copies it. That becomes the rule of law. Trial and error learning creates law just as much as it creates market success.
Does it count on that process that I guess you could call it a coalescence around one of the stable decisions? Sometimes you get results in certain kinds of cases that are more a reflection of culture and morality or differences in people's cultural or moral priors than you might in, say, what is a stable equilibrium or a stable outcome. Does common law allow for that variety or that diversity in, let's say, one just jurisdiction versus another,
Yeah.
or in yeah, just one standard of law versus the other?
Yeah.
How does that work?
It depends on it.
Yeah.
Common law depends on diversity, on variety. Common law is about settling this. Common law only exists when there's conflict, when there's disputes. If we're cooperating perfectly right now, we don't need rules. We cooperate. Something happens. You're upset with the way I behave. I think that you're doing something wrong. We have a conflict. What do we do about it? We need a resolution. Common law is the law that arises out of settling disputes. And the way you settle disputes for human beings, we do it by trying different solutions and repeating the ones that work and not repeating the ones that don't work and create more strife. And we learn in this way. And common law, it depends on variety. It's not stable. If you have a very distinct theory of justice, then you're not a supporter of common law, because the common law is not going to embody any theory of justice. It will depend on our background, cultural beliefs, and things like that. It will be as advanced as our society is in some sense. It's a little ahead in the sense that it always results in something that produces a peaceful rather than a violent resolution. So it actually,
Why does it?
yeah, because if it's a violent resolution, people keep fighting and it doesn't work.
What if it's just an oppressive resolution?
It's possible. It's always possible that a common law system can provide unjust results. It can provide unjust results in particular cases. Sometimes wrong, sometimes unjust, and that's the nature of human beings. If you're in that kind of culture where the interaction of human beings culturally is very oppressive, imagine the alternative. What if you took some people in that culture and said, okay, you're in charge, go make the rules? The common law didn't evolve by itself segregation. Remember, segregation of the races had to be implemented through legislation. If the common law was good at segregating the races, we wouldn't have legislation. The common law is only as good as your culture, but in a situation like that, the only alternative is to give some part of the culture power. And when you have people with legislative power, they tend to favor their interests over others. Once again, in the real world, you're only making comparative choices. By the way, if you come up with a way of making sure that whoever makes the law only makes just law that's always right, then I'm for it. But in the real world, that's not one of our options.